On behalf of Parliamentarians for Global Action, it's both my pleasure and honor to welcome Ms. Benazir Bhutto, former Prime Minister of Pakistan, here today. Ms. Bhutto has kindly agreed to speak on the daunting topic of democracy in the New World Order. I must say, on a personal note, it gives me particular pleasure to welcome Her Excellency, because one of the other times that I heard her speak was when she was the principal speaker at the Harvard commencement, at which my daughter was graduating. So her presence brings back some fond memories for me. For those of you who are not familiar with the event of which this luncheon promises to be the highlight, we're meeting here today as part of a global dialogue on the New World Order to help chart a course for the New World Order that remains today a vague concept yet to be fully defined and agreed to by the nations of the world. This event has been organized by Parliamentarians for Global Action, an international network of legislators working across party affiliations and geographic boundaries in search of global solutions to problems affecting the international community. It is my pleasure to serve as treasurer of the organization. I'm delighted to see that this gathering has attracted the attention of leading parliamentarians from literally all over the globe. For it seems to me to be critical, if the New World Order is to be an improvement over the old or cold world order, that the principles that guide us must be formulated through a broad process of consultation with the whole of the international community. Clearly, the United States must, in my view, take a leading role, but it is vital that we hear from all those who must be our partners so that we may, together, in shaping the post-Cold War world, forge a world that is more peaceful, free, and prosperous for all. Thus, we are very fortunate today to have with us a leading voice in the global struggle for representative government, one who knows all too profoundly the difficulties and the tribulations that effort entails. By way of background, Ms. Bhutto holds a degree in government from Radcliffe and completed her graduate studies at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, where she was elected president of the Oxford Union, the prestigious university debating society. She was the first foreign woman ever to hold that office. In 1989, as I had indicated previously, she was awarded an honorary doctorate in laws from Harvard University. Benazir Bhutto has faced formidable challenges throughout her lifetime. It was an historic achievement when, at the age of 37, she became the first woman head of state of an Islamic country and was responsible for restoring her nation to civilian rule. We in the United States Congress last received her when she spoke before a joint session of the House and Senate in her capacity as Prime Minister of Pakistan. Among the accomplishments of her government for which she takes the most pride are the doubling of Pakistan's education budget, a quadrupling of foreign investment, a 50% decrease in the inflation rate, and the restoration of constitutional principles of freedom of association and freedom of expression. Today, she continues to lead the Pakistan People's Party, and I know we are all eager to hear her unique perspective on developments in her own country as it struggles to build democratic institutions, and the lessons that she is drawing from the dramatic global events of the last 2 years. So without further ado...
But it's been especially significant for me to come here today to the global parliamentarians, because I too am a parliamentarian. And I commend the initiative which was taken by Canada in beginning this intra-parliamentarian dialogue. In fact, I have been trying to persuade the president of the global parliamentarians to send a delegation to visit Pakistan and to see how our parliamentarians are faring. I do believe that such global exchanges will further enrich our experiences and enable us to offer political and moral support to each other. In fact, as a parliamentarian from a Muslim country, it was my desire to see a Muslim women's parliamentary union, because none exists. And as Prime Minister of Pakistan, I thought it would be a great service if one Muslim country could see that another Muslim country too had women parliamentarians. And in a day when fundamentalism is on the rise, I think it's important for women parliamentarians in Muslim countries also to make their presence felt. That's a task. That's a task I left unfinished, but which I intend to finish, which is why I'm still in the political battlefield of Pakistan. It's also especially significant for me to come here to the United States at a time when tremendous changes are taking place for the entire world community, and particularly for freedom and for democracy. For the people of Pakistan, for the people of Eastern Europe, for the people of the Soviet republics, indeed, for the people of Central America, the years 1988 to 1991 have been years of tremendous change, when it seemed that almost overnight dreams were turning into realities. With the communications revolutions, with the advent of the fax machines, and even CNN as an international network of information, it seems that ignorance is disappearing and greater awareness is growing. And with this greater awareness, we are all becoming citizens of the world. For we have entered the last century, the last decade of this century, interconnected, intertwined, interrelated, and interdependent. People in the East Bloc saw the free societies in the West, and they asked a simple question: why? They compared it to the repression in their own lives, and they asked a simple question: why? People in Pakistan saw democracy in neighboring India and other countries of South Asia, and they compared it with the repression in their own lives, and they too asked a simple question: why? In every country, from Nicaragua to the Russian republics, when given a choice, people chose freedom. They chose freedom because there are values on this world which are universal. Freedom is one such value. It is a force of history which cannot forever be denied. If I may quote to you the philosopher poet of Pakistan, who once wrote that life is reduced to a rivulet under a dictatorship, but in freedom it becomes a boundless ocean. And that is why, whether they are people living in the villages of Balochistan or people in the Ukraine, whenever they have been given a choice, they have chosen freedom. And freedom means, above all, the right to vote in meaningful elections and to elect a government of one's choice. But for me and the people of Pakistan, our roller coaster experiment with democracy has not been an easy one, and the restoration of true democracy and human rights still remains for us an elusive goal. The last 14 years of that odyssey have been filled at times with tragedy, at times with triumph, at times with sadness, and at times with joy. For many of those years, we witnessed in Pakistan a brutal military regime which overthrew the elected government, executed the elected prime minister, suspended the constitution, banned political activity, banned political parties, and subjected the press to rigid censorship. While narcotics barons flourished, women were subjected to legal discrimination, and student and labor unions banned. I watched my own father executed on a trumped-up charge of murder, despite international outrage and calls of clemency from the Muslim world, the Western world, and indeed from the communist bloc. For almost 6 years, I was imprisoned, sometimes in one jail, sometimes in another, sometimes under house arrest, sometimes in exile. But in August 1988, General Zia, the military ruler, died in a still unexplained aeroplane crash. And his death paved the way for the holding of elections in Pakistan. The military backed the election of a new president, President Ghulam Ishaq Khan. And although many of our supporters were disenfranchised, although my party was denied the right to an election symbol, so important in a country with widespread illiteracy, I led the Pakistan People's Party to a convincing victory against the forces of fundamentalism, against the forces of a well-entrenched establishment, and against the forces which had organized dictatorship for more than a decade. On December 2nd, 1988, I became Prime Minister of Pakistan, the first woman ever to lead a Muslim country in democratic times. It was not just a personal victory for me, and I do not see it as just a victory for my country. It was the triumph of an idea, the idea of an enlightened Islam where men and women are equal. As soon as we formed the government, we put into practice what we had preached for so many years. We immediately freed the press, freed political prisoners, and we planted the seeds of democracy, nurturing, cultivating, feeding, at first fragile institutions, which we hoped would one day develop into a strong, capable, and just political system. But those 20 months were not easy for my government or for my people. The entrenched forces of dictatorship would not let go. They were not willing to leave the privilege and power which they had enjoyed, and they used their resources to start a massive campaign of disinformation. And as a woman, I faced an additional burden from those in my society who believe that a woman's place is behind closed doors. I remember when I first became Prime Minister, pamphlets were distributed by a fundamentalist party in which one of the fundamentalists said that he had dreamt he saw the Prophet with tears of blood running down his face. And he asked the Prophet, "Oh, my Prophet, why are you weeping tears of blood?" And the Prophet replied, "These tears will not stop till that woman goes." So such were the ways that the fundamentalists dreamed of in trying to destabilize and depose my government, forgetting that the Holy Book itself had pointed to the rule of Queen Sheba and described it as a land of plenty. I'm proud to say that my government brought an economy in ruins to life. We introduced privatization, not denationalization, not selling public sector enterprises to a handful of individuals, but trying to broaden the scope of shareholding in the country by allowing professionals and middle classes to buy shares instead of spending it the money on consumer items. We made difficult decisions to reduce the domestic debt and non-developmental expenditure. We cut non-developmental expenditure by 3 billion rupees and refunneled this money into a grassroots anti-poverty program. We didn't do what was popular. We did what was necessary. And Pakistan prospered. The World Bank and the IMF lauded our efforts, and the United States ambassador to Pakistan called my government a role model for third world countries. We cut unemployment by half and reduced inflation to 5.6%. And simultaneously, we addressed the long neglected social needs of our people by increasing education expenditure by 70%, health expenditure by 40%, by drawing up the blueprint for an ambitious population control program, and earmarking funds for women's development. It wasn't easy when we had to pay off military debts. It wasn't easy when we had an IMF program. And so to fund these programs, we involved ourselves in the largest ever resource mobilization that Pakistan has known, 1.4% of GDP, as opposed to 1% of GDP. And within the political constraints under which we labored, my government did everything possible for the well-being of the women of Pakistan. If I may give you two small examples, we lifted a 10-year ban on women taking part in international sports. And after a decade, for the first time, Pakistani women could compete with their sisters in international competitions. We opened a women's development bank to give loans to working women who wanted to open boutiques or salons or export garments. It was a bank run by women for women. But we did allow men to keep their money in it if they so wished. But this was only a beginning. Elected for a 5-year term, we had the hopes and dreams of transforming our nation. But we were unable to complete this task. Just 4 days after Iraq went into Kuwait, the forces of fundamentalism moved in Islamabad, and in a military-backed coup with constitutional window dressing, so similar to last month's fraud in Moscow, my government was sacked and a state of emergency declared. My political opponents were taken into the new government, becoming the Pakistani equivalent of Moscow's Committee of 8. But unlike the world's reaction to the attempt against President Gorbachev, a distracted world stood silently by while democracy was dismembered in Pakistan, and fabricated charges of abuse of power were brought against my government ministers, my party colleagues, and even my family members. I was threatened with dire consequences if I contested the elections. And this was a particularly difficult time for me, because in the past, as leader of the opposition, fighting General Zia, I did not have 2 small children. And at this particular time, I was caught between my obligations as a mother, between my obligations to the lawyers who were fighting the legal cases against my husband and myself, and of course, obligations to the people of Pakistan, because we were involved in a political campaign and I had to address campaign meetings. But I knew one thing, that my commitment to the people of Pakistan came first. And in the months of August, September, and October, I spurned all offers by the Pakistani government to go into exile, although I was threatened that if I stayed on, I would be disqualified and my husband would be sentenced. I was encouraged by the people of Pakistan who supported us and came to every rally in large numbers. Every poll, every analysis predicted that the Pakistan People's Party would win the elections. But as I feared and publicly stated, the forces that organized the dismissal of my government in August 1990 were not prepared to see me re-elected in October 1990. In those elections, we bore sad witness to a massive electoral fraud in Pakistan, with fictional votes being added to government-sponsored candidates. This is not just my claim. The most conservative report published by the NDI admits that 15% rigging took place. The French report goes much further in enumerating massive rigging which took place. And as time has passed, the former caretaker Prime Minister has admitted that rigging took place, but he was unable to stop it. The caretaker Minister of Water and Power has admitted that rigging took place and he was unable to stop it. And so have two former coalition party members. On August 4th, 1991, Mr. Naveed Malik, who is here with us coincidentally today and was an advisor to Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, held a press conference in which he said that on the eve of the elections in Pakistan, a meeting took place between the security agencies and the government, where it was decided that the Pakistan People's Party number of seats would be kept to 45. The Minister of Interior also said publicly that the PPP would not win more than 45. And he said this was done by adding 20,000 votes to each government candidate through electoral cells that had been set up in the 4 provinces. This was not the first indication of electoral cells. The NDI team had also noted the functioning of an electoral cell in Balochistan. 20,000 votes per government candidate. That amounts to 7 million votes. I'm sure those kind of numbers would have kept a Democrat in office for the last 3 terms and made sure that Mrs. Thatcher was not re-elected in England. There is a lesson for all of us in this, not just for the people of Pakistan, but for all of us in transitional democracies. Because democracy is not just balloons and buntings. Democracy is not just about buttons. Democracy is about the sanctity of the ballot. And when the sanctity of the ballot is destroyed, democracy is eroded. And that is why we must all share our experiences as parliamentarians and recognize that democracy can be fragile, and fragile democracies need support. We are aware that Mrs. Aquino's 5-year experiment with democracy in the Philippines has faced 5 attempts, including one which needed to be put down with the armed intervention of the United States. In Argentina, there have been more than half a dozen military rebellions, and in Peru, narcotics and terrorism threaten a 2-decade experiment in democracy. I remember when I was alone in prison, I was so heartened to hear that Senator Pell in the United States had linked United States assistance to Pakistan to the restoration of full civil liberties and representative government. The US and other countries today are making it clear that aid to Eastern Europe will be predicated on freedom and economic liberalism. These efforts at informal ad hoc networking for democracy need to be strengthened. Democratic nations, and here the global parliamentarians can play a role, need to forge a consensus against the most powerful idea in the world today, the right of a people to freely choose their government. And that is why I believe that there should be an association of democratic nations which can support democracies in countries where there is no democracy, share experiences with new democracies, and set up two important components. One I would call the human rights component, and the second I would call the vote counting component. Mrs. Aquino would never have won the elections if NAMFREL had not been there as an independent vote counting machinery, because the government declared that President Marcos had won the elections. Perhaps I would be Prime Minister today if NAMFREL had been counting the votes in Pakistan. Thus, the Association of Democratic Nations needs to sponsor a vote counting machinery as an independent verification of a government vote count. The second aspect on which I give importance is the question of human rights, because any government...
Great public dissatisfaction.
And there are forces in Pakistan that would have been delighted with a renewal of the Cold War, which they could have played off to their own advantage. The Association of Democratic Nations could help change the calculus for all potential coup plotters by enabling them to know that they would face international outrage and international disgrace. Ultimately, the door could be kept open even for economic sanctions. And I believe that what is at stake here is not just international morality, but also international peace and stability. There's a simple fact, although it's much overlooked, and that fact is that democracies do not start wars with democracies. At least I do not know of an example in modern history of one democratic nation going to war with another democratic nation. Thus, democracy is the only guarantor of international peace and stability. An association of democratic nations could promote the idea that foreign aid and economic investment be channeled to and restricted to only real democracies. There is nothing wrong in rewarding an idea in which the donors believe. A frontal assault on basic human rights is taking place as we speak today against the people of my country, Pakistan, where thousands committed to democracy have been arrested from streets, have been kidnapped, tortured, and even murdered. I mentioned earlier to our hosts that in Pakistan, parliamentarians belonging to the opposition, I am leader of the opposition, have been kidnapped. The first time the kidnapping took place was in November, second time in December 1990, then in February 1991, and now again on August 4th, a member of the minorities belonging to our government disappeared for a whole month till September 5th. His family wrote telegrams to the president and the prime minister. In the newspapers, articles appeared that the parliamentarian has disappeared and his family have alleged that he has been kidnapped. The party has alleged he has been kidnapped. But not a word of concern from the president or the prime minister. Not a word of concern from the speaker. Ultimately, the parliamentarian appeared and defected to the other side. The main accused in a case against my husband is a parliamentarian. He held out for 6 months. But after 6 months, when he wanted to be free of jail, the chief minister of the province went to him and offered him his freedom if he defected. The television cameras were brought into the prison to televise his defection. Members of parliament have been called terrorists unless they defect. One member of parliament was vacationing in the hills when a dead body was recovered from his living room. It had been planted there by the police. And when a Washington Post stringer wrote stories about how the police are fabricating cases, he received 17 stab wounds. And that is not the only case of intimidation of a journalist who has dared to write police and the state is doing. Unfortunately, dictatorships always seek to garb their crushing of political opponents in the cloak of legality. And that is why it is so necessary to have an independent human rights commission which can look into cases brought against political opponents to see whether those political opponents did in fact commit a crime and are seeking refuge under political status, or whether the state is committing a crime against those political opponents. And that is why an association of democratic nations should have a human rights component. Because of the silence of the world, even today, my husband and colleagues are in prison cells, and they have very little hope of getting free without the executive branch wanting them to be free, because the executive branch has set up special courts. I'm pleased to say that Canadian observer team, the French observer team, and indeed the English observer team have all come and examined the special courts and said they do not provide a fair trial to the defendants. I'll give you an example. My former Minister of Law was disqualified by a special court. The special court wrote in its judgment that although the prosecution has failed to prove its case, because the onus is on the defendant, we find him guilty. Now, because it's a contempt of law in which judgments cannot be discussed, the press cannot write about this judgment. Legal opinion cannot discuss this judgment. Another special court judge in Karachi, sentencing 8 boys to death, wrote, because President Bush says that convictions do not take place in Pakistan and there is lawlessness, therefore I convict these 8. President Bush doesn't even know about the special court trial taking place in Pakistan. But again, because of the contempt of law proceedings, nobody can examine these judgments, and that is why my party has suggested a reform of the judicial system and said before a judge is confirmed, he should appear before the Parliament's committee and all his judgments should be scrutinized. We also intend to repeal this contempt of court law once we come into government. I do believe that democracy in the new world order demands that basic tenets of freedom and human rights be protected whenever and wherever they are threatened. We cannot pick on one coup and not pick on another. We cannot afford to choose one massacre and not choose another. We cannot afford to make a distinction between one fraudulent election and another. People who believe in democracy cannot condemn a coup in Moscow and remain silent when one takes place in Islamabad. Selective morality is immoral. People who believe in human rights cannot condemn 3 deaths in Moscow and remain silent when hundreds die in Kashmir. Selective morality is immoral. People who believe that human rights should not be violated cannot remain silent when human rights are violated in the Middle East. For selective morality is immoral. The new world order and the victory of freedom against totalitarianism has put the onus on the forces of freedom not to pick and choose, but to universally and unquestionably and immediately speak out when democracy and human rights are being violated. That, I believe, is the moral imperative of the new world order. Despite my frustration and yes, even anger over the coup against my government, the blatantly fraudulent elections, the tragic setback to democracy, I am determined to continue to struggle for our common cause of freedom. Despite the pain I feel, even as I speak to you today, that my husband is held for no other crime than being married to me, I believe it is important not to give up. I remember my father's last letter to me, written from the death cell, in which he quoted the words of Robert F. Kennedy. And he said, "Every generation has its central concern whether to end war, erase racial injustice, or improve the working conditions of man." Today's young people appear to have chosen for their concern the dignity of the individual human being. They demand a government that speaks directly and honestly to its citizens. And then my father added, the possibilities are too great, the stakes too high to bequeath to the coming generation only the prophetic lament of Tennyson. Ah, what shall I be at 50 if I find the world so bitter at 25? I am guided by those words, and that is why I was so pleased to have this opportunity to speak with the global parliamentarians. I want you to know that I was due to go to Puerto Rico for a well-earned holiday, but I decided to come here and be with all of you and to speak to you as one parliamentarian to another about our common concerns for freedom and the common efforts that we should be making for its preservation. I shall now be very happy to answer some questions for you, and the number of questions will depend on as to how much time Congressman Green can give us.
Thank you very much. About 15% of my constituents are of Puerto Rican origin, so I don't know whether they'll take very kindly to my having kept you from going there. But I think maybe 10 minutes of question and answer would be fine.
I don't really have a question, but like a woman and a Mexican legislator, I would like to tell you how proud we feel, all the women in the world, when we can meet a woman like you, and you are really an example for all of us. Thank you for everything, and thank you for your
Thank you. Thank you very much for your compliment.
Could I ask Ms. Bhutto about the election monitoring process? You quoted examples from your own country, but is it not a fault of existing election monitoring processes that they're always too late and too superficial? I say that as one who's taken part in one myself, that what we need is something far more fundamental, which is exploring the conduct and mechanism of elections before the actual elections themselves. It's not just enough to turn up and see the votes being cast and maybe watch the counting.
I couldn't agree with you more. In Pakistan, we believe that 50% of the rigging took place before the actual election day and 50% on the election day. In my own experience, monitoring teams cannot do much because they go to just a few stations and they leave immediately after. What is important is a standing body and an ongoing mechanism for examining the entire process leading up to the election and involved in vote counting. I think NAMFREL is the only example where there was a vote, at least the one that I know. And that's why I think it's so important that if we believe in democracy, we not give the forces of dictatorship ways of sophisticated rigging to hoodwink the world.
Bhutto, I was quite embarrassed by your comment when you said how many of us expressed outrage at the coup in the Soviet Union and were distracted by what happened in your own country. I would like to know if what is happening at the present time in terms of international bodies, UN, Commonwealth, other areas, to exercise a form of sanction against the ongoing suppression of human rights. What are individual countries doing to provide aid to Pakistan, both military and economic, and would you care to offer some suggestions as to what we might do from this point on?
I think that as I mentioned, the Canadians sent a team to observe the human rights situation, and the French have most recently in June sent a team which concluded. And we have had some observer teams coming, but we think that having more observer teams would be an effective way. We have not yet had an American team visit Pakistan, And I was mentioning that it would be important to have global parliamentarians come to see how parliamentarians are doing in Pakistan, so that those who have been kidnapped or those who have been maltreated can explain. And this could form effective moral pressure. The United States is not giving any assistance to Pakistan at the moment over the nuclear proliferation issue. My opponents had waged an election campaign saying that I was soft on nuclear because I spoke of non-proliferation, and I spoke on the need for India and Pakistan to tackle the question of non-proliferation and mutual arms reduction treaty. And they said if elected, they would detonate a bomb. Obviously, it was an electoral ploy, but now they're caught between the promise they made to the people and the assurances they would like to give to the United States in getting the aid resumed. I would like to see the United States government broaden the scope of its negotiations with Pakistan, not only to focus on non-proliferation, but also to include electoral reform, human rights, and narcotics control. I do believe that the narcotics barons and the financial oligarchy in Pakistan combine to destabilize and bring my government down. In fact, the disclosures that have come about BCCI are very interesting, because the present government seems to be almost an extension of the BCCI bank in Pakistan. The president of Pakistan is the president also of the BCCI Foundation in Pakistan. A BCCI official has claimed that the president of Pakistan gets $80,000 a year for being president of the foundation, but he says he gets nothing. The president's son-in-law works for the BCCI. The chief minister of Sindh has admitted that he used to get money from BCCI when he was living abroad, and he has said he will not extradite the head of the BCCI. The prime minister of Pakistan has taken a loan from BCCI for the Himalayan textile mills, which he set up. So they're very strong connections. And it seems to me that the financial oligarchy and the narcotics barons got together because my government was one which was cleaning up the country, and they didn't like what was happening. Pakistan is very much forgotten. Today, the United States is so involved in, and not only the United States, but the Western world, North America, in the Middle East and the Soviet Union, that they are not focusing on Pakistan. Afghanistan is over, even though for us it's not. We've got 3 million refugees. So the focus is not on Pakistan. And I'm here in a way also to remind Americans, don't forget Pakistan, and to try and build up a grassroots support for what is, to speak out against what is going on in Pakistan. I tried to involve the Commonwealth because I felt that if the United States is too busy with the Middle East and the Soviet Union, why not the Commonwealth? And I wrote to the Commonwealth Secretary General, or was it their human rights person, asking that a human rights delegation visit Pakistan. And they told me that they could not visit on the invitation of the leader of the opposition, but only on the invitation of the government. Now, no government which is doing human rights violations is going to invite the Commonwealth to come over. But I do think the Commonwealth is an important platform which should be revitalized in the changing world situation, in the sense that I see their friends from India here, that I think one of the most important concerns of the subcontinent is a mutual arms reduction treaty and an agreement on non-proliferation. But I think somebody needs to bell the cat. And the bureaucratic pressure on governments in India, the pressures on, popular pressures on a government in Pakistan are such that I think it would be very difficult for any Indian leader or any Pakistani leader to actually bell the cat. So we need a Camp David-style summit. And if Secretary of State Baker is too busy, I think the Commonwealth and John Major may be ways, or maybe Canada and the Commonwealth could be ways to make India and Pakistan sit down and address this extremely important question. Both our economies are in a tailspin, and yet there's tension rising up over Kashmir. The Soviet Union and the United States started de-escalating once they started arms control talks. So in my perspective, arms control talks are important if the fallout is to be on other issues too.
In view of what you said about the involvement of your president and prime minister in BCCI operations, you might enjoy hearing of how BCCI is described in the Indian Parliament. It's been described as a bank of crooks and criminals international. But now to come to the main point, we heard with great interest your diagnosis of what has happened in Pakistan and how democracy got derailed. Of course, in our subcontinent, as you know, we have a great genius for diagnosis. But what is the remedy? What are the steps you think which could be taken to restore democracy, a healthy democracy, and a true democracy in Pakistan? And one last comment. I'm very happy to hear from you about this talk about mutual arms limitation, because as a journalist, I've been advocating it for a very long time, saying that if the West could have swords, we could surely have more, which is mutual arms limitation.
That's good. Well, I think you've had a great influence, because I had the opportunity of sounding out your former Prime Ministers Chandrasekhar and Prime Minister VP Singh, and present Prime Minister, then he was in the opposition, Narasimha Rao, and all of them, and even the militant Jana Sangh, and they were all in agreement for a mutual arms reduction treaty. So I think political leaders on both sides of the divide are ready, but somebody needs to bell the cat. The opposition parties in Pakistan have all got together, and I've learned a lesson not to go it alone. I think Pakistanis like broad consensus, and what we are arguing for is the establishment of an interim government of national consensus and an independent electoral commission to hold elections in Pakistan. For the interim period, we want this government of national consensus, and then on an agreed time, whether 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, we want elections held under an independent election machinery. But we do want a broad-based government, because I think Pakistan needs stability. Since 1977, there's been a conflict between the establishment and the people. The one has not accepted the other has not accepted the one. Unless there can be some kind of compromise, we cannot really tackle the larger issues such as malt, or such as non-proliferation, such as our ties with America, our ties with India, even population growth inside. So what Pakistan needs is a period of peace, but a period of peace can only come about if there is a representative form of government, and not if people feel that others are making the choice for them.
I think I do have to cut this off, but let me just call up for a couple of words to express the thanks of all of us to you. Dr. Mona Makram Ebeid, Member of Parliament from Egypt.
Thank you. On behalf of Parliamentarians for Global Action, I would like to thank you, Mrs. Bhutto, for having shared such a humane experience with us, and where I suppose the standing ovation that you have received has expressed more than any words that I could tell our admiration for your courage, your persistence, and most of all, your genuineness to share with us this very hard experience. We wish you all the best. We are sure that one day democracy will be restored, and they will owe it to you in great part. Thank you for being with us.